There's going to be, thank you, we're recording now. The DSI blog post from Dawn. So we do a wrap up of everything that we've accomplished within these working groups every 3 to 4 months. And we are looking to do one probably in the next 2 weeks. Is there anybody on this call right now that is interested in helping to put that together? If you are, feel free to just throw it down into a bullet note here. I'm happy to help with that over this next week and bring in some of our new details. Does anyone have any thoughts or comments on a blog that's coming out or anything we want to make sure that we highlight? Nope. Okay. I think that's all right. Next on our list is discussion around ways to measure adoption. And I think we have time for that today. Does anyone know, is this a note from Dawn or
No, it's me.
excellent. All right, let's
I
go.
saw that there wasn't much on the list, and I thought, hey, let's throw this in there because it's something we're working on.
Um,
So let me go ahead and paste in some of the discussion that we've had. So for figuring out project success and for building your contributor pyramid to see, because your first stage of a project, right, is here, let me fix all of these. Okay. For figuring out whether or not your project is even ready to go on to trying to recruit contributors, one of the things you want to look at is how many actual adopters do you have. Plus, you put a lot of effort into building up project awareness, and you really want to actually measure how effective that's being. The problem is, unlike contributors, um, users are not users don't necessarily need to have any direct contact with the project. So we did some brainstorming in my team at Red Hat about different things that we could possibly collect that we could put together that would give us an idea of adoption. And the challenge, of course, is most of these metrics are relatively expensive to collect. Um, Either because it's difficult to get them at all, or because um, the data source is different for every single project. Um, and they're all lossy. They're
mhm.
all bits of information that give us an idea of adoption and usage without giving us numbers. So I'm pretty sure other people have worked on this and given it some thought. So I'm happy to go over the individual metric ideas that we had, but I was hoping to get some additional brainstorming about how people are working on measuring usage at this point.
Yeah. Well, one comment that I have on this, the thing that is really from, so we've been playing with what data we've been able to scrape. We've got it pretty cleanly from CNCF and from Eclipse. Apache, it's a little bit harder to get specifically like their Slack or like wherever they're having their community
Mhm.
conversations on. That's really hard to track, which is unfortunately for us looking like it's one of the strongest signals. So like one of the highest when you look at specifically CNCF, one of the highest predictors of if they're going to graduate is whether or not they have a Slack starting in their incubation. Like there's some really interesting things already sitting there. It's hard to get some of that information just because it is not standardized and it's not metadata that the stewards have traditionally collected.
Yeah, I'll I'll
Um,
I'll also say, as somebody who's a Slack administrator for Kubernetes, the Slack statistics are not trustworthy.
Ah, okay. Good to know.
I
In what way?
because we used to use the data that we got, the telemetry we got from Kubernetes Slack, as part of our general project reporting, and then we had some counterintuitive data show up in terms of, for example, who were the most frequent posters. So since this data was so surprising, we dug into it and we found out that it was just absolutely not true. That posts were getting assigned to users who didn't make them, for example, in the stats.
Okay. Yeah,
Um, the and the thing was, if we knew those stats weren't true, then we didn't know whether or not the other stats were true.
exactly. Yeah.
So um, the but one of the other things is, when I'm looking at building up a project, I separate users into sort of two layers, right? Um, I the sort of upper layer is would be your users on Slack, which is what we call involved users. So these are users who have direct contact with the project. But if the project is actually being adopted, you should have a much larger group of what we call silent users. That is, users who use the software but have no other contact with the project. Um, the and and again, you want to know whether or not that silent user group is growing or shrinking, right? Because that's sort of the base of your whole adoption. Um, and often, if you're a situation where you're measuring the involved users and the number of involved users isn't growing and it's small, right? You want to know why, and the most likely reason is that the number of silent users is actually not as large as you think it is. Um,
Mhm.
Back in the day, we used to try to estimate the number of silent users by downloads, um, but there's a whole bunch of problems with that stat, with general downloads. Um, One thing that we have done in Kubernetes is specifically look at downloads of patch releases,
Mhm.
out of the belief that somebody who is downloading, a patch for a recent security hole is much more likely a real user than somebody who's downloading a major release.
Mhm. That does make
Um,
sense. There are also
Again,
many real
yeah,
users that do not do the security patches.
yeah. Well, there's a whole bunch of problems with it. Number one
Yeah.
is, first of all, Kubernetes as a project has a larger portion of its user base getting binaries directly from the Kubernetes project, right?
Hmm.
If you look at another project like, say, Fedora, like Debian, right? Or Postgres, um, they only have a tiny minority of users getting binaries from anything where the project has telemetry,
Hmm.
which would still be fine if they knew what percentage that minority was, but they don't.
Yeah.
Um, the and unfortunately, when you only have a tiny minority, you can't even trust changes, right? Because an increase in downloads from the portion that you have monitoring on might just indicate a shift on where people are getting their stuff from, not an increase in the number of people.
Yeah.
The
And
I mean, to
it's
give you an example of one of those where I actually could measure it, um, there used to I in 2004, Postgres released its first Windows version, right? And um, for about 2 years, huge numbers of downloads of the Windows version, right? Constantly growing. And then in late 2006, Windows downloads fell off a cliff. And we're like, are people not using Postgres Windows or whatever anymore? No, the answer actually was a very popular Windows download site called CHAOSS started carrying the Postgres binaries. Um,
great.
the so so like we
Well,
can use
that,
the patch releases for Kubernetes because of the nature of Kubernetes user distribution thing, but it doesn't necessarily transfer to other projects, right? Who don't have the same relationship with where people are getting their stuff.
yeah. Okay. I have to turn off my oven because I just remembered.
Mhm.
I will be back in just 1 second. Does
Yeah.
anyone have any immediate thoughts? Because I have a couple that would be really interesting to discuss. Good. I'm in my kitchen for that precise reason.
Okay.
Um, so yeah, I mean, what I think would be more interesting to start thinking about is can we find trifecta constellations that make sense, right? Because,
Mhm.
okay, it's going to be challenging and computationally inefficient to go and find where people are aggregating their binaries from now. But as long as you see stable or rising participation in the communication channels, that should even out that proxy. You know that it's still growing or dying based on that. In your experience, if you could choose right now or have like a magic wand and had three constellation metrics that work together, what do you think would be the best design?
Well, for the problem is it still depends on category of project, right?
Right.
Because if we had a project that is like a library or an infrastructure project or something else that's used always together with other software, the number one thing I would like to have, but definitely falls under the heading of a super expensive metric, right, is references to the project in other projects.
Okay.
I just haven't figured out a way to compute that without running analysis over the entirety of GitHub. Um, the um,
Yeah.
I would say
And that
website traffic is probably good because it's relatively inexpensive, um, and is something that all projects have, right? Or should have, or could have if they wanted to, right? You need to look at it over big windows. You need to do things to smooth it out because, spikes tend to be more of an indicator of, say, mentions in the media than they are of anything happening in the short term. But, over the course of 6 months, if your website traffic goes up substantially, then that probably does indicate an increase in the number of people who are at least thinking of using your project. Um, the Up until recently, Stack Overflow was also a good signal, but AI is pretty much destroying that. So, going to sort of drop that. For old projects, mentions on job boards is actually good. I don't know if you're familiar with the database trend site. Um,
Oh, there's a
Hello?
note here in the chat that we missed. An idea. You might want to look at the
I'm
patch
sorry.
releases. There's a note in the chat that we missed,
Okay,
and
okay.
it says, just an idea. You might want to look at patch releases that specifically patch a CVE of medium severity or later. Yeah, I think this is sort of what we
Mhm.
were speaking to. Many orgs prefer to avoid patches until there are concrete security impetus. Yes, I'm aware, and I wish we could do better. It also means, so I think there's also the challenge around doing it by security metrics, especially using that as a baseline for like contributor community, is that it's going to be an extremely strong signal of mostly, I would say, your regulated clients, consumers, right?
Mhm.
Ones that have patch requirements are represented in that. And then you have a bunch of laggers that are still sometimes in the community. And I will say there is usually a very low correlation between the people that are highly engaging on Slack and the people that are highly engaging in the security remediations. Different
The
groups. But
Yeah.
still trying to capture them all here. So that I think that does capture your silent majority a little bit better. Um, But I'm wondering if there's anything else, because website traffic, I think we could get. Um, I'm just going to throw this out as a sort of a last thought, and then we can sort of dive in further on here. But does anyone else have a metric that they find or think is interesting? I do think it's pretty easy to just go and scrape the README pages of each of the projects, and specifically in CNCF, the cross identification or the verifying that something is an ecosystem. Um, it could be helpful, and I think I can maybe get those stats out of them. So, any ideas from anyone else? I find these really interesting. And I think this is probably something where we need to spend a little bit of time and like read through and review these metrics. But would you be open to coming back and letting us do like a much more in-depth
Yeah,
like Q&A on this? Excellent.
yeah.
Um, does next time work for you or another time that we can coordinate?
Another time, my challenge with this meeting, by the way, is that I have three different biweekly meetings that are in the same time slot.
Hmm.
So occasionally they line up so that I don't have a conflict,
Nice.
or the conflict that I have is boring. But you might have noticed I only make it to like 1 out of 4 of these meetings, and that's why the
Yeah, I think that's no problem. We can probably start this just by continuing this conversation right here on the notes, because a lot of
yeah,
people will visit these within the week. Then I'll
yeah,
consolidate a group of questions because I think this, especially if we
yeah,
take this now, we have enough data to actually play with some of these hypotheses, um, and do
yeah,
at least an A/B test with CNCF and
yeah,
Eclipse, which is good.
yeah. Yeah. Related to this, one of the things is, as soon as KubeCon is over, I'm going to play with one of these. Is that one of the indicators you see there is bug reports. Um, the part of that requires differentiating bug reports from other kinds of issues. The So I'm going to be playing with some new machine learning libraries to see if I can actually do that, because there's several reasons why I'd want that stat. Um, the so um, the and and see if we can actually differentiate that, right? Because somebody who makes a single bug report about something they encountered themselves is a user. Um, Somebody who um, makes a bug report about the architecture of the project is a contributor. Um, and I think that is something that some of the new machine learning can differentiate at this point, but we'll have to see.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think GitHub has made it easier for us to be able to track that. So I think that would be worth looking
Mhm.
into. I will say my favorite metric still right now is mean time to update. So I was working, and this is across ecosystem, this holds true. But for anything, we've got secondary and tertiary dependencies, as Kubernetes always does. You can predict whether or not it's a project is going to be vulnerable in its next release based on the combined average of how recently all of the dependencies that it takes in were updated, right? So this is where I think the slicing and dicing is just specifically for the ecosystem of CNCF. It really makes sense to choose those like overarching projects that then
Mhm.
establish your substacks within them and seeing if that entire thing has a shared or collaborative release schedule that represents a stack. If you find that, then that might actually be really, really effective, because that would represent the entire like vulnerable surface area of a production environment, which would be a concern. But that's my security mind. A couple of notes here in the chat.
Yeah, let's go ahead and put that in the notes there.
Yes, I'm going to throw that
Yeah,
into comments here.
there we
Excellent.
go. Yeah. Um, I'll admit to being skeptical about phone home mechanisms, but the you know, this is a hard problem, so try everything. Yeah. Okay.
Okay.
Thanks.
Excellent. Thank you. Honestly, this is a lot of good stuff to think about. And if I can get it into testing, I'll see if we can get some answers. So yeah, we will loop back around to this, but I will make sure we got a written list of questions to you before, so you
Yeah.
can use your time
I
that way.
mean, my grand vision is eventually to have some kind of a model that can take into account you having some pieces of data but not others, and still make um, an estimate of growth versus lack of growth and you know size within, like, say, 5 categories of magnitude. Right, you're never get an actual number, but
Yeah.
the but if you could say, hey, you know this project is adopted by a few experimenters versus this project is clearly being used in production by a lot of people, then that's really what we want to know.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, this is an interesting problem. So create a predictive machine that is tolerant to lossy data to get a better proxy for the silent majority for projects. Does that seem fair? Cool. Yeah. We will definitely talk more about that. I think for now, if no one has added anything else onto their agenda, then we've got plenty of time. But feel free to speak up now if there's anything else that we want to add. Anything? Okay. Then for upcoming meetings, we're gonna learn what Callie is learning from the event that I believe they're at right now. So that'll be next week. We're gonna cover and do a like written Q&A to get some metrics ideas. And also when we do that Q&A, I think I will pull that up with some of the interesting data that we've already found so that we can spark along the lines of like, let's actually test this if I have the data. Um, Rethinking the archive project, we can cover that another time, but I do think that is getting tabled for now. And then in the future, I think it would be a very good idea. Yeah, Michael, if we want to cover the Fedora project stuff, I would love to cover that today if you want to go over it, or we can save it for next time when Dawn is present. Don't think Michael wants to cover it today. Adrian, go ahead. Oh, I see. Great. No worries. I'm going to go ahead and just run through the rest of this, and then we will catch you on the audio in a second. Some quick reminders. There's CHAOSScon, which is right before FOSDEM. And if you would like to come, we need to put in abstracts very soon. So make sure to do that. FOSDEM DevRel CFPs are opening up now. I believe they came available on the 26th. And Scale is also coming open or is now open for the rest of the month. So if you're interested in any of those, absolutely, but definitely the CHAOSScon EU, which is a good
Yep.
reminder to me. I got to submit.
Yep. Please submit proposals to Scale. I'm actually on the Scale program committee, so if you have any questions about what's appropriate for that, ping me.
Excellent. Cool. Perfect. Okay. Let's uh let's see how your audio is holding up.
Can you hear me now?
I can.
Nice.
Excellent.
I had to
You
disable all the.
do you want to take the screen or just to discuss?
I don't really have. I didn't prepare anything. I wasn't. I was expecting to just kind of lurk here,
Cool.
but I guess if anybody isn't aware, I've been uh, basically tackling all angles of trying to build a Fedora data lake, all the data engineering, all the infrastructure, et cetera, et cetera. The current plan is going to be Iceberg v3 kind of as the fundamental thing, and then we're going to try to put Trino in front of that. But a lot of our data would make sense with the new variant type support, and Trino doesn't have that support yet. So we're going to probably wait until that is available. And also, I'll just say, our primary data source, the first thing we want to get into this data lake is we have an internal message bus, and this tracks everything from inter-system communications. Somebody updated something on GitHub and it sends a webhook, and we do something with that. But it also includes a lot of like direct user activities, like somebody created a new project in their personal like packaging space where we make our Fedora packages. So it captures a lot of different types of activity from a lot of different sources. It's also really going to be difficult to process because all of this is captured as JSON. It's like JSON in a Postgres column. So that's why the variant support, I think, is going to be critical for us. But I've been kind of doing this in a solo way, and I didn't really have a deadline. And so I've just been kind of bouncing around between different facets of this. But we recently had somebody come into the project who is an actual data analyst, which I'm not. I'm an infra nerd who like has an interest in data. They've asked for basically any data sets that we can make available today. And so just to kind of get something out into people's hands, I've been able to process a portion of our enormous historical message bus data. Some of the messages on there are like somebody decided to send a 2 gigabyte file through the message bus. And
Oof.
so you try to process that with like Pi Arrow and it just explodes. So it's been a challenging data set, and especially since I don't really know the whole ecosystem. I'm running, like I've had to file a few Pi Arrow bugs and not really sure the best way to go about it, but I'm trying to get there. Anyway, I'm hoping by the end of today, and my goal for today actually is to get the data that I have been able to basically clean up and convert into Parquet out into Cloudflare. Actually has a really nice, they're in beta, but they have an Iceberg managed service where all of the egress from that thing is free. So it's a really great option for making data publicly available. I don't think it's going to be able to be our long-term Fedora solution, but just in terms of, I'm just a person tinkering, trying to get there. Obviously, like it doesn't cost. The only thing I have to pay for is storage costs, which are actually like a tenth of the equivalent like S3 storage costs. So it's super cost
That's not
effective.
bad. Yeah.
So I'm just going to try to get something out there, and I'll share that out. I'm a little bit on the fence about what I think the right schema for those things should be. So it's not going to be a stable thing, and it's really only going to be the early years of Fedora, because once they started adding different integrations, it's usually the first couple of messages in there where they had a lot of oopses that got captured and created like 2 gigabyte Postgres rows. So, so you get to a certain point, and then systems turn on, and then you struggle to process that data. But anyway, I also have some ideas to get through that stuff. But I'll just say I don't really have anybody to bounce any of this stuff off of. I'm kind of winging it, figuring it out on my own. I did make a message in one message basically in the CHAOSS Slack at one point of like, hey, here's something I'm struggling with. And I didn't really get any traction, and that's fine. But if anybody knows any good communities, either within CHAOSS or elsewhere, to kind of bounce some of this stuff off of, I think some of this, some of these challenges of like 2 gigabyte rows are a little bit unique. Like hopefully, maybe not. I don't really know this world. Maybe you see that all the time, but
Yeah. Why?
Yeah.
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 Why wouldn't you just exclude those as not very useful outliers?
Yeah, I thought about that. So I was able to process the data. I basically set a maximum size and just kind of truncated the data when I saw something bigger than that. But I've just kind of floated the idea out there that I'm going to be trying to collect this data, and I've realized that there's actually a lot of different use cases, and what seems to be a pretty strong hunger for like the ability to get into this historical data. For reasons that aren't just like community health metrics. Some of the packaging people want to see some of the history of some of their certain packages. I don't really know what all the use cases are for this yet. That's a part of, I've had a few people speak up. I think there's probably a lot, we do have a lot of people who are silently interested. So I haven't been able to like gather all the use cases. So my goal for this was, let's figure out how to make like the canonical, historical record of this data set. And once we have that, and that might not be something we want to make available. Like that wart from Postgres might transfer into Iceberg and transfer into other people's workflows, right? So we probably will want to create like a filtered version. But I wanted to kind of create the right now, the only way you can get to this data is you have to download an enormous backup, like the entire history of this thing, and run it yourself, and have like plenty of hardware to do so.
How
My goal is to just like get everything
Yeah, I
available
would say,
somewhere without like a truncated version, and then all of the rest of the processing can happen based off of that. That can be our base layer that we build on top of.
um, so let me say how I handled um, having an enormous amount of text markup, not well structurally documented data in the past, particularly for like civic data projects, where that's very common. Um, but as a warning, this might require making different infrastructure choices, um, because the way that we generally dealt with this is we would import it into a format that would accept the markup, right? So like a Postgres JSON column. This is in fact directly how JSON got added to Postgres as a feature, um, was because of such a project. So directly into something that'll accept that Postgres JSON column, um, Couch, Mongo, something else that can handle contextually structured data. And then you go on fishing expeditions, right? Somebody decides that they want to find out something about release prep, right? And so they start looking for those messages. Eventually, they find the right tags for that, and then they create an ad hoc index for that markup. And then if the data becomes useful, they use that ad hoc index to extract that data into a fully structured set of columns, um, and write in uh, ETL procedure around it, right? So that it'll get automatically extracted in the future. Um, the challenge with that, with the setup that you've done, is that it's only at that last stage that it could go into Iceberg. Because as far as I know, Iceberg does not handle contextually structured data.
Yeah. So right now, I don't know if you guys want to get into the weeds with me right now or not. I'm happy to. I'd love to.
we got time.
Okay. Yeah. So right now, the we have every unique system that's putting data into. So this database is called Data Nommer,
Mm-hmm.
and every system that is producing data into this thing is supposed to be using some sort of a standard schema. And so we have the concept of a topic within our messaging system, right? Like what sort of message is being sent, and there's supposed to be essentially a fixed schema per topic. The problem is we have like 72,000 topics. So all of the messages are being stored in a Postgres varchar column right now. And so yes, so there's two ways. There's two aspects to this. One is that yeah, as of Iceberg v3, they, they do support the variant type, and the variant type is intended to allow you to basically have sort of like push down for essentially arbitrarily structured JSON, where you don't actually have a real schema. It's not as efficient as a real schema, but it makes it possible to at least not have to pull every single row to look for the to see if this row has the key I care about and the fields I care about. So that's why a part of my challenge here is I'm trying to use like Iceberg v3 was released I think in like May, and I think Spark started officially supporting it in like June or July or something like that. So it's like really new, and that's why Trino doesn't have support for it yet. And my original tack before I realized that there was this variant support was exactly what you're talking about. So we have done some exploration of which topics have the sort of user activity that we care about. Those topics do, or at least in theory, are supposed to have like a consistent JSON schema. And so I've created some like basically bespoke tooling to say, okay, here's a topic we care about. Go infer a schema, because the reality is that the apps don't always
Hmm.
comply with their own schema. So I need to go infer one from their actual data, and then extract. My original thought was to basically extract, okay, here's a topic we care about, extract that as its own table with a well-structured schema, right? And then make that available. And I've been calling that like our silver data sets. But even so, I actually have like made some progress within that avenue. The problem is that you need to infer a schema and cross the entire data set, because some producers will just not provide a key if the value would be null, for example. And a lot of our data is, I'm trying to set like a fairly reasonable bar, and I don't know if I'm overshooting or undershooting, but a lot of our data has stuff that's like a really long string, which is an enum in reality, right? And so if I can turn these things into enums, it becomes much more efficient to query them. But that means I need to see the entire data set to know all of the possible
Hmm.
values of that enum, right? So I have not found like a great tool or a set of tools that just does all of this automatically. Honestly, like DuckDB does a lot of like the first pass stuff for me, but then I still have to go in and figure out which of these, varchars should really be enums, and optimize like integer types. And so there's still like a manual pass before I get to where I feel like, okay, this is like a reasonable schema for this particular topic, and then I can go publish this. But yeah, so it's been a lot of what bespoke tooling, and I've been like self-conscious that like there has to be a way to do it. Like this is like not a unique need. I just don't know what the the best approach is, and that's where I chose some libraries like Pyro and ADBC. This seemed like a good idea, except for those ADBC specifically is what explodes on Postgres 2 gig rows. So I can get some topics, but not other topics, because some topics are well behaved and some aren't. So anyway, that's the whole story. And part of what I'm wondering is, I've been hoping that basically if I can lean on this variant support, that I might be able to negate the need for all of that bespoke schema creation and inference and all that kind of stuff, and just lean heavily on variant support. But again, it's I'm like using very fresh releases that aren't very well documented and maybe have some bugs and stuff. So that's kind of my
Hmm.
status. But yeah, any aspects of that anybody has suggestions for tooling or approaches, I'll take what you got.
I mean, I'm going to tell you, I actually know something about the Fedora data,
Okay.
and I don't really think you're going to get away from having individual ETL workers for each piece of, data, each topic that's interesting to you. Because, structurally they're so different. What's interesting about them is different. Um, at best you could do, you have tooling that would discover the fields and what, possible data exists in those fields. And but in terms of actually getting meaning from that, it's going to be a gradual process of a human looking at it. Going
Yeah.
going through each topic and saying, "Hey, I want to actually look at approval messages, right?
Right.
And see what's interesting about the approval messages, because an automated system can tell you what data you have. It's not going to tell you what data is interesting.
Yeah, and that's where I'm saying that I'm trying to target a reasonable bar for, I guess, value or quality, data quality, because one of our members has done some exploration here already, identified some interesting topics, gone and pulled the entire data set, parsed every row as JSON, right, and pulled some insights out of that, which is super useful, but also super computationally inefficient. And that's where I'm trying to decide, for example, should I just, I don't think I should, but one thing I could do is just dump everything out to JSON, right? And just say, here, everybody is your pile of JSON. go parse it yourself, right? But I'm trying to make this efficient. The goal here, I think, for me is to get to the point where we have BI tools and dashboards, right? And so having some amount of minimal computational efficiency here is I think, a requirement in my mind anyway. So that's why I'm concerned about, how exactly is the data encoded and so forth. But I also need to balance that realistically with how much labor do we have to go, polish all of these topics. I mean, even just the subset of topics we've identified, there's probably there is about 450 topics. So I've made like 10 or so. I've selected like 10 or so topics that are like I've gone through and polished those up into schemas. But there's the labor factor of like creating those initial schemas, and then also like if that app ever decides to change its schema, I need to be able to detect that in a way that allows me to like recognize I need to adapt the workflow. So there's a lot a lot of balancing act there, and
Yeah.
I don't know how
Well,
people typically approach that.
so what stands in the way of putting this on some kind of massive JSON data source, whatever that is, right? Whether it's a scalable version of Postgres or whether it's one of the document databases or whatever, and then turning loose Fedora people on it.
Yeah, there still would be some. There are some fields, some columns in Postgres outside of the JSON message structure that are relevant. So there would still need to be a pass of read every row and basically rewrite the schema slightly. But yeah, that's certainly possible. Launching any sort of a public service is difficult inside Fedora
Well, I mean, the thing
because
is, yeah, the number of people who would actually play with the data is going to be pretty small.
yeah.
So you could actually limit it to, giving people individual accounts rather than making it a full-on public service.
Yeah. So right now, where I was going with that is like to make anything available at all. So currently, this data lives in a database that the infrastructure people are not comfortable with really providing any access to, because it's already a very intense like process, hardware intense process. Like running that Postgres database takes a lot of hardware, and they're worried that ad hoc queries or anything like that might tip it over. So we are leaning on, they do make backups of this database. And that's how you get access to the data right now. Any sort of new thing that we're going to launch to make that data available in any other way is a pretty big hurdle. And so my thought there was, if we have to jump that hurdle, let's jump it once. Let's kind of target, like, for example, if I make it available in Iceberg, right, then anybody can connect to that and query it. Anybody who wants to bring their own engine can connect to it and query it. And you can also make those Parquet files available for download, which is a lot more accessible than like, a 1.5 terabyte PG dump. So that was kind of my thought. But I mean, yeah, I'm negotiable. Like if the same thing could be made. So what I want is to be able to facilitate something like CHAOSS wants to analyze all of the data, right? Or whatever. You want to analyze it all like every once an hour or once a day or whatever, right? And that you can bring your own load to that work by basically downloading our Parquet and run it on your thing if you need to, right? So that's my hesitation with like, let's just set up CouchDB or Mongo or something.
Yeah.
Well, no, and I said, just whatever format. It's just, from my experience, giving some kind of access to the people who are actually looking to use the data, is going to accelerate things considerably compared to waiting on you personally to make certain segments of the data available, if you follow me.
Yeah, absolutely.
Um,
Yeah, getting
um,
new contributors engaged with
you
the
know,
process. Yeah.
um, because if you have somebody who says, "Hey, I'm really interested in um, how we handle moderation," right? And so I'm going to do a bunch of digging around and then eventually come up with this JSON query that actually seems to give me the data. Then they can just turn that JSON query over to you, and then you just have to make that into an ETL procedure rather than figuring it out in the first place. Um, the um, Although I have to ask one question: isn't there a bunch of PII in here? In there?
So that's a good question. There are a couple of answers on that. One is that all of this data is already available
Mm-hmm.
in several different formats. Anybody can download this Postgres dump,
Okay.
and there is an API that lets you make very small queries, very like kind of pre-structured
Mm-hmm.
queries for certain pieces of data. It's called data grepper. So all of this data is already available in multiple formats. There's an API and there's a full data
Okay.
dump. So there's nothing new there. But yes, once like this whole project is all about lowering the bar of access to running your own
Yeah. Okay.
analysis on this stuff. So I am assuming that if when the day comes and we announce like, hey, there's a data lake, people are gonna wonder like, what do you know about me? Like, am I okay with
Mm-hmm.
that? So I've asked around Fedora to try to get some official answer because I'm assuming that GDPR and all those sort of questions were already answered a while ago, but I don't actually know that. I'm trying to find out. I'll say that for the data sets I've reviewed so far, I haven't seen anything that in my opinion needs to be redacted. I haven't seen any like end user IP addresses.
Okay.
There aren't any, for example, like chat messages or anything like that. What we do have is basically like usernames in various accounts. And my thought, or my first thought, I guess I should say, is that none of our systems require you to attach a real name to your username. So if you want to anonymize yourself, you can make your own randomized username or whatever, and that's what goes into our data set. And that if you've chosen not to do that, if you've chosen to put your real name on things, that you basically have agreed to,
Yeah.
tie that information to you. But I don't know if
Vendor
how that
sharing.
flies legally or
Yeah,
whatever.
I would say it's unlikely that you have PII in this data set, given what you've been scraping. The
Okay.
thing that you do sometimes run into are emails, but they tend to be maintainer emails that are publicly available.
Yeah,
So
yeah, and
that's
we
a
have our whole
Okay.
we have the
Yeah.
public mailing list archive available,
yeah.
right?
Okay.
Yeah,
Yeah, I mean, if there
We
isn't,
oh, go ahead.
I was
Then
going
I'll
to say
jump.
if there isn't PI, then that makes things much easier, right? Then the only thing you have to worry about is uh, hardware resources.
right. And that's why, yeah, like I said, that was part of my strategy. There is we'll provide the hardware to make the data available, and then if you want to run queries on it that are super hardware intense, then that's up to you. Or maybe we can get to the point where we can provide a query engine. Like I wanted, for example, to provide Trino, right? But that's going to be probably a second phase thing after we get the data into Iceberg, or something equivalent.
Well, I'm going to try to manage this meeting as Dawn would and say that we close 10 minutes till.
Okay.
This is a really good discussion. And I think it's one that's worth having and continuing, especially we don't have quite as many contributors on this call as we usually do today. But I think we could have a really lively and continued discussion around this. What I would say specifically for the Fedora project, I think would be interesting if you can come back to this meeting in a few weeks or even next week and just kind of put it into a like slide or bullet point sort of format. Give me the technical stack, give me the problem areas. Because while we're probably going to have more people on this call, the next call, there's a lot more people that I can make sure we get the answers from, especially if it's around building a good query engine. A few people have really good answers to that. Um, but for today, I wish we had more time because I would like to cover both of these topics a lot more. So If you're not on the Slack already, do get on the Slack. It's our best way to sort of touch base in between these calls. And is there anything that anyone definitely wants to cover before we jump today?
I'll just follow up and say I am planning to make a couple different presentations in the very near future for Fedora. So I will share those here, either recorded or decks and whatever.
Yeah, yeah, because I think that'd be really interesting. And again, yeah, the people that can't make this specific time, there's about 4 times as many that are going to see the recording. So, but for today, we've got some good notes on here. If there's anything that you want to add or change about the notes, go ahead and do that today while it's fresh in your mind. Um, put something on the agenda for next week if it's important to you. If not, I will see all of you and more in just 2 weeks. All right. Thank you all for coming.
Thanks, everyone. Much appreciated.